We're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Sellery. I am the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and I'm saying that a second time, not because I didn't believe you heard me, but because we are now welcoming our live stream viewers, and this is also the video archive of our event today. We are unabashedly proud to be Canadian at the Canadian Club, and we have been for 123 years. If you can believe it, that is how long this club has been in existence. Canada is a resource-rich country, and we produce high-quality goods and services, and we send them to markets all around the world. Today, we are very excited to be talking about how businesses can be more global in their thinking about export opportunities, and our panelists are going to discuss that, the hows, the whys, and what the opportunities are. A specific and special welcome to our youth and young leaders who are in attendance today from the Munk School of Global Affairs. Are you over there? You can say woohoo, you can say go Munk School, hooray, welcome. Thank you for coming. I also wanted to say that we are very grateful to McCarthy Tetrault, represented by Godin Sebe, and PwC, represented by Miles Gooding, for their sponsorship of today's event. Round of applause for them. In particular for funding the dessert, which was delicious, and this table you're not delivering on expectations, so I expect you to consume more of the dessert as the afternoon progresses. There is a lot happening in the world today, a lot, politically, environmentally, economically, sometimes all three unfolding at the very same time. And that can have us be, I said tense earlier, I could say jittery, I could say uncertain, and so it is very, very important for Canadian business to constantly look for new and different opportunities. And when it comes to export markets, the opportunities really are endless. So we are going to hear from our panelists about why the world needs more Canada and how to give it to them. Let me introduce them. Kevin Au-Yeung is the CEO of Nobis, a luxury outerwear brand available in over 30 countries. It recently had a viral moment when Sergei Ivanka gifted each of the Raptors a massive Nobis scarf. You have to look at these scarves. They're massive. How long are they, like 6 feet long? A little under 6 feet tall. Yeah, they're huge. Kevin is also the president of the Association of Chinese Canadian Entrepreneurs and is a regular delegate on the China and Japan trade missions hosted by the city of Markham. Martha Harrison is a partner in the International Trade and Investment Law and Retail and Consumer Markets Groups for McCarthy Tetrault. She is also the coordinator of the firm's advertising and marketing practice. Martha is recognized as a leading Canadian international trade lawyer by a number of industry and peer-reviewed directories. Hilton Go is the president of Levelwear, a premium apparel and lifestyle brand behind many of the licensed professional sports gear that you see in stores. Hilton is also an active member of the Young Presidents Organization and is a graduate of the Harvard Business School President's Program. Todd Winterhalt was appointed Senior Vice President, Communications and Corporate Strategy at Export Development Canada. He has held increasingly senior roles since joining the EDC 18 years ago? Is that what that says? That's a long time. 18 years. Like it, wow, I had to double check. Todd has also served in the Canadian Diplomatic Corps, including Consul and Trade Commissioner at the Canadian Consulate in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Obrigado. Moderating today's conversation is Anita McCouat. She is a partner at PwC, where she is the national leader of the Technology, Media, Telco, and Consumer Markets Practice. That is a very long title, very long. She is also the president-elect of the Canadian Club, and she is going to give us a quick overview of the latest PwC exporting report, of which there are copies at your table. Anita and panelists, the Canadian Club of Toronto's podium is yours. Anita.
Thank you, Bruce. All right, let's kick this off. Thanks for coming today. So, good afternoon. As Bruce mentioned, I'm Anita McCouat, and before we jump into the panel, I thought it would be great to take a few minutes just to level set on where we are today when it comes to exporting. We all know the US is by far Canada's largest trade partner. Americans buy 76% of our goods, so they're a good trade partner. But we also know they've taken a more protectionist stance with the election of Trump. And by all accounts, we could be seeing a second term with Trump. So, there has been a decrease in trust when it comes to trade between the two countries. And with all of that uncertainty, I think Canadian companies would be smart to look a little broader for some more trade partners. Happily, it just so happens we've recently signed 2 new trade deals, the CETA with Europe and the CPTPP with a group of Asian countries. So what we should be seeing is, exports globally should be going up, right? Not so much. Not so much. Canadian companies have been rather slow to take advantage of these trade deals, and we've actually seen other countries, like France, for instance, importing more into Canada as a result of these deals, but we aren't exporting more. And then when we look at the types of things that we export, it's really dominated by oil and gas, resource, agricultural sector type products. But we also have so many great consumer goods in Canada that we're not really exporting as much. So to help answer the question as to why and maybe how we could boost that number, PwC commissioned a study and undertook a study last year. And we actually surveyed 3,500 consumers from 7 countries, and they're all countries that are part of the recent trade deal. So we looked at, let's see, Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Mexico, and the UK. And we spoke to people from all ages and demographics, and we asked them, what is their perception of Canada and what is their perception of Canadian goods? So what did they say about us? Well, there were 4 things that really stood out. And the first is, and not surprisingly, people really like us. 96% of respondents had a positive view of Canada. In particular, the top 5 traits that they associated with Canada was friendly, clean, trustworthy, reliable, and sustainable. And actually, friendliness was the #1 attribute in all of the countries surveyed, except for Japan. In Japan, the #1 attribute was cold. We surveyed across 6 product categories as well, and there were 3, they were all positive, but there were 3 that people really showed a propensity to buy Canadian, and those were food and beverage, alcohol, and fashion apparel. The second interesting finding was that desires differed among age groups. So across the board, younger generations were more likely to have an intent to buy Canadian goods. For example, millennials have a high desire for Canadian alcohol, cosmetics, and fashion. And then more than half of Gen Z consumers said they intend to buy furniture and home goods from Canada. So there were many insights across different categories. And if you are interested and curious about the data as it relates to your product, we actually have a couple printed copies of the study on the tables, and it's all available online as well. The third interesting thing came when we delved a little bit deeper into why people are interested in Canada. And it turns out they're interested in our stories, and they're interested in our history, rather young history. Many survey respondents had some sort of Canadian connection, which makes sense when you think about our diverse society. Many of them had a family connection or history to Canada. So when I think about that, and I combine that with the 5 traits I just mentioned, to me it signals a real marketing opportunity for Canadian companies as they look to build their brands and build partnerships abroad that maybe we aren't taking as much advantage of as we could. We're going to discuss that in a minute. There are some examples of companies that are exporting well and they really seem authentically Canadian. I think about Lululemon, branding as high quality yoga and lifestyle. all the luxury outerwear brands that are having a moment, a Canadian moment right now. We've got Nobis, represented by Kevin, but Canada Goose, Moose Knuckles, and others. So as a category, it's great. Canadian ice wine. But I think that there are maybe some opportunities for less obvious product categories to take advantage of these natural positive associations that people have about Canada. Okay, the last nugget that I'll share from this study is that we asked consumers, what prevents you from buying Canadian in your country? And overall, the top answer by a wide margin was, Canadian products are not available in my country. So it definitely feels like there's some untapped opportunity and potential. So with that in mind, I'm going to join the panelists on stage so we can chat about how we can give more Canada to the world. Let's get started. Okay, let's kick it off. Martha, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay.
Because you work with lots of companies doing this. There has been a lot of protectionist rhetoric coming out of the US. But are your clients actually feeling a difference, or is it really just business as usual?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thank you to everyone for having us today. And on behalf of McCarthy, Tetrault, I'd like to thank the Canadian Club as well. We are absolutely seeing an increase in client angst as it relates to the US market. Certainly, and not surprisingly, as a partner in our international trade group, the typical clients that I'm dealing with who are Canadian, as opposed to foreign clients, are indeed looking to the US as a place to sell their goods and services for a whole host of reasons that we already know. It's a familiar legal system, it's a familiar trading partner, geography makes sense, it's relatively easy to negotiate contracts, shipping is easy, all of those aspects that surround a trade or a logistics deal as between Canada and the US are sort of smooth sailing when compared to other jurisdictions. But what we have seen with our clients is that the sort of tense rhetoric that we hear coming out of the States, as you referred to, Anita, that has caused some anxiety in terms of future investment into the US. But generally speaking, clients still need to consider US as a very important trading partner, and they're not necessarily looking to, exit the US market. Frankly, in most instances, they just have to have that as a market. But what this new trend in trade has facilitated, in our experience, is a real motivation for Canadian clients to start to look for diversification in markets. So rather than exiting the US market because of some strained trade relationships, what a lot of our clients have been doing is exploring new markets, primarily guided by trade agreement opportunities that put them at an advantage over, for example, their US partners and their US competitors. In the same vein, as a practitioner in the area, I've had the occasion to follow all of the sort of Canadian-U.S. trade negotiations. We finally have what appears to be the final, in the States it's called USMCA, but in Canada we're starting with the CA. And this agreement will carry on the opportunities that Canadian firms have to continue with that cherished relationship with the US. But again, what we're seeing is a desire to look for foreign markets, and in particular, a couple of markets of interest are what you mentioned in the EU because of the CETA, and then some of the Trans-Pacific countries because of the CPTPP, which I will refer to as the Trans-Pacific Agreement.
Yeah. Thank you. Todd, we know that companies are more resilient when they sell into more than one country, and the more that they add, the more resilient they are. When you look at the Canadian business landscape, are companies as focused as they should be?
So short answer is I don't think so. We've done a significant amount of research at EDC over the last few years. On average, we'll support somewhere between 15,000 and 17,000 Canadian companies export or invest abroad to over 200 markets. And the numbers haven't moved, to your point. I would be very much aligned. with the findings that you had in your report. What we have seen is kind of a good news, bad news story. And in one sense, if you go back to 2000, only about 5% of Canadian exports actually went to emerging markets. So outside of the US, outside of markets where we have a trade agreement. 20 years later, that number's about 12%. So some small level of growth. And at the same time, the focus is very clearly still on the United States as a place to start. And I think you have to kind of dig into the numbers a little bit to understand that some of that is very segment-based. So smaller, medium-sized companies almost certainly want to start in a market, like Martha indicated, where there is some familiarity, they're comfortable. The legal, the regulatory environment is quite common. The larger companies are more apt to be willing to go a little bit further afield. As I say, we're starting to see slow change in that, but what also causes us pause at EDC is that over the last 20 years, in the OECD group of countries, Canada is last, frankly, in export growth over that period. And so that's kind of why I could go to no right away. So I think we'll talk more as the panel progresses around how can we help to start change that view. And for me, it probably starts with awareness. So it's around how do you build up that level of comfort within the Canadian client base, and in particular on the small side, to understand that markets like the US or even some of the longer, more anchor markets in Europe could actually be springboards out of the US or out of the UK, for example, to other more emerging markets in nature.
Interesting. Kevin, so you've been successful in branching out beyond the US. You're in 30 plus countries. And I think Korea and France, it's stronger footholds. You're in a category that lends itself to existing perceptions of Canada, maybe. How important has the Canadian story been for you as you build your brand?
Sure. Well, like you were mentioning earlier, I mean, there's natural properties or attributes of Canadian values that are more strategic than the others. When you kind of so for us, we do identify very much with things you mentioned about being friendly, actually being politically neutral. As a country, actually, is helpful for us. Being innovative is something that you don't see very often, but it's actually being received as a perception. So for us, we and high quality as well when it comes to particular commodity, I guess. But for us, we do present ourselves first and foremost as a 100% Canadian-owned company, and we do try to align our values, in marketing, strategically, not over leveraging, but align ourselves with those values. We say, from an ingredient standpoint, we'll highlight, we're one of the only very few brands who have 100% Canadian down that we source from particular farms in Canada. We highlight the fact that we're 100% Canadian-owned, unlike a lot of competitors who are American-owned, actually. We also focus on things like we do a very interesting research with UBC on developing, and there's patents we can't over-disclose, but synthetic materials, and is a significant research, and that will lend it to a lot of the implications for us to tell a story about sustainability, as well as being innovative within a Canadian context. So short answer is yes. We've been leveraging those values very strategically, and it's been very well received. And like Europe in particular, and Asian markets as well, do think very highly of Canada, to a point where actually there are some retailers that we deal with that have a Canadian name in it, when they're in France, and there's also Italian brands out there who are, actually call themselves Canadian something when they're an Italian company. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is. We were confused when we were at international trade fairs. We're like, what? But apparently we were well liked.
So they're using the positive attributes of Canada to market their non-Canadian products.
Right. I'll walk up to them, but no, I didn't do that. So.
Yeah. So staying with you, Kevin, as you thought about expanding into certain markets, how did you decide where to go to next after the U.S.?
Oh, there are a number of, we've done a number of things. First of all, we focus on, identifying a bit of a product market fit. Obviously we are more winter heavy for the Nobis brand, and we identify markets that had a premium, demographic and have both the climate for that. So, and then we focus on those 2-3 countries where we want to really do well in. and rather than, oh, let's, kind of attack everybody.
Right.
So with that, we, did a really good job in places like South Korea, and where we actually were able to create viral moments like we did, in Toronto here. And with that, we actually, with also identifying very good partners, which understand our culture, which is way more important than sometimes finding a big distributor partner. So, we actually have that experience as well, where we go to a different country, where we work with a very large multi-billion-dollar company, and you're one of the 100s, that we work with. And then at the end, we actually, the Korean experience taught us that is more important that you work with someone who understands your culture and is willing to dedicate a meaningful amount of time and effort for promoting, working with you, rather than just, just because they're big, they must be better. So for us, actually, Korean is one example that we worked with a very small distributor among the 5 options that were presented to us. And it was, we ended up being number 2 in the market behind Montclair, and we have 30 direct retail shops, seasonal, a lot of them, but it was creating a very great presence for us there.
It's a great story.
Yeah, thank you.
Hilton, how have you leveraged the Canadian story, or do you think you could do more of it? We were talking at lunch.
Yes, before I start, I would like to say that the numbers that Todd quoted, 75% of sales are to the U.S. That reflects kind of our numbers, and I think just to justify ourselves, I think to us, the U.S. market, because we've only penetrated 10% of our potential in the U.S. market,
Right.
we've remained focused on growing that U.S. market. So that's one part of our story. Now, speaking of ourselves as a Canadian brand and how we've leveraged the Canadian identity, thinking about it, we actually have been telling our Canadian story through, on the golf side, we have some of the best Canadian golfers, representing our brand. Adam Hadwin and Corey Connors, we're the major sponsor of the Canadian golf events, the RBC Canadian Open, the CP Women's Open, and the Show Charity Classic. So we've told our story there, and our partnership with the National Hockey League. We're a global partner of the National Hockey League in terms of merchandise. We tell our Canadian story through that as well. Associating ourselves with hockey and with the #1, hockey league in the world. So I think that's our experience, and we do still have a lot of work to do, selling to markets outside the U.S. and Canada. And the number that I was going to share is, I think our sales outside of U.S. and Canada is about 5 to 7% of our revenue. So we're typical of a lot of the Canadian experience.
Todd, we have talked about how so much of Canadian business, especially in the consumer goods area, is small and medium-sized enterprises who may not know where to start. They're focused on the U.S., that's fine. Think, oh, maybe I should go somewhere else, but they don't even know where to start. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so, and I mean, some of it is really just a pure business driver, though, to Hilton's point, right? I mean, if you're barely cracking a major market like the U.S., there's certainly additional opportunity there. But it is the market that it's also the easiest to learn about and to find out about. Mm-hmm. And so to go beyond what's very traditional for Canadian companies, it does require effort. And so I think, we haven't talked about yet today, but is the partnership that's sometimes required to take that leap, to get beyond the US or beyond, in some cases, Mexico or a European market, to go somewhere a little further afield. And there are really a number of organizations, whether it's a Chamber of Commerce, an industry association, law firms, accountancy firms, freight forwarders, you name it, who actually have very well-developed programs to share some of that information that can make it seem a little less daunting to a smaller company, in this case, looking at going kind of beyond where they maybe normally would. But Anita, you mentioned off the top, our research would show that Canadian companies who go beyond that one market or beyond 2 markets are much more apt to have healthy workforce, to have higher profits, to really have a much longer term strategy for their organization than those who really focus on either domestically only or one market. And so it's almost like back to that awareness concept. How do you get that kind of level of information and knowledge in the hands of the companies when they need it? And again, I think it is not kind of point to point or by any one organization, but it's in ecosystems kind of coming together to be able to provide that and really kind of give almost a solution to a small or medium-sized company looking to export. Otherwise, it does feel like you're just kind of one point-to-point solution, which is often quite difficult then to make something kind of come out of that.
Yeah, that's right. Martha, what would you say is a good strategy for a company that's looking to start?
Yeah, the strategy is so contingent on the actual good or service that is to be sold, right? So you kind of have to know your product, your service. You have to understand where it may be sellable. And for example, in Kevin's case, he identified the fact that his product would obviously sell probably better in cooler markets and cooler places. So knowing the product and knowing what distinguishes your product from a market sector perspective is very important. And then you can also look to different service and sales models that would fit your particular opportunity. For example, if you are a small and medium-sized enterprise and you're looking for the first time to internationalize, either within the US or maybe outside of the US. Sometimes direct-to-consumer is a good market flow to take on. You can leverage online sale platforms where you don't need to have a bricks-and-mortar presence in the foreign market, and where you don't need to necessarily contract with an on-the-ground expert who can help you facilitate important relationships to drive larger local sales. So, in some instances, especially in the consumer markets and goods area, direct-to-sales model to start is often quite interesting. If your business is a little bit larger, if you have the sales and marketing capacity and the production capacity to create, hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of units in a short time frame, you may be more interested in bypassing the direct-to-consumer space and entering right into local partnerships. So that might mean contracting with a domestic partner who will act as a sales agent for you and your company. That might mean you attending and for example, at a trade show and getting to know partners yourself, or probably a combination of all of these things. And certainly that might also mean contracting eventually with whether it be a significant retailer in that jurisdiction, whether it's a grocery store, whether it is an online platform that offers huge inroads into commercial sales, so not just direct to consumer. Those are all different options that can be considered when you're looking to expand. Each has advantages and disadvantages, of course, but it's largely based on the product and the service that you're trying to sell, and whether or not you have any experience in that market and how close it is to that market to markets in which you're already dealing. So it's quite a leap to go from a no international presence, or perhaps presence just in the US in the form of sales arrangements or whatever the occasion might be. It's quite a leap to go from US only sort of overseas, whereas it's much less of a leap, as Todd mentioned, if you're already dealing in Europe and you're dealing in lots of opportunity in France, let's say, which is quite a good spot for a lot of the Canadian consumer goods in particular. It's a lot easier to go from there to Spain, for example. And with every different transaction that is made available, even if it is commenced with a direct-to-consumer method, it becomes easier and easier, and you know how your product sells externally, and frankly, you've probably hit some hiccups along the road that you can correct as you move forward into your other jurisdictions. And organizations like EDC are so fantastic for small and medium-sized enterprises who are looking to develop internationally, whether it be through an insurance product to help facilitate the exchange, whether it be for advice on the other side. The government actually has a whole host of free resources that you can leverage, global affairs, consular affairs, et cetera.
Great. Yeah. Great advice. No bill for that advice, folks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Kevin, I'm conscious we have two apparel reps on our panel today, but food and beverage was the #1 category that was flagged for interest in Canadian goods. And I know with a different hat that you wear, you have some knowledge of food and bev.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I represent as a volunteer the Association of Chinese Canadian Entrepreneurs. We're like a national business network where we have the different business owners in a very broad industry base. So food industry is a part of it. I was going to say that before, just to add on to actually Martha's comment, actually does relate to food and beverage industry. The e-commerce that you were mentioning is actually a very effective way if I've seen for other, the food and beverage industry, or also for myself, as a test, not just to just sell. You do get a lot of data about, for example, when we open up our website to Europe, we have no idea which countries, will be a mixed point to kind of spend more resources in. But we'll be looking at data and say, wow, look at this traffic from Germany is actually surprisingly higher than Norway, which we allocated most of our resources in. And then we would go back and say, wait, maybe we were wrong, because direct to consumer these days are way more telling than what you go through a traditional wholesale path would suggest. Because in our industry, and I'm sure like Hilton's similar, you started building your brand and go into trade fairs and you expose yourself and you wait and see, right? And that has been the approach, and nothing wrong with that. But these days with the e-commerce side, it's been very powerful that way in terms of giving you directions. Now, back to the food industry. I noticed that a lot of our members do leverage is the one natural category to leverage Canadian safety element. So in their marketing, they do talk about the natural ingredient aspect of it. We have members who is the manufacturer with one of our winners as well with nutrition supplements, and they highlight the natural aspect, the process, and actually the safety, the innovative processes that is in complying with all the Canadian laws, etc. Does give the consumer the confidence. And then there's other, food industry, like we have members that sell seafood, like decent volume, and they found that their markets for Germany and for Asia is equally, significant. So it's quite encouraging to know that, in the cross-section based in Canadian industries, they're being received quite well. Yeah.
And I think, you were telling me one story where a manufacturer would set up a plant here just to be Canadian and then export it back out, take advantage of our...
That's right, we were talking about this earlier. There actually was an instance recent. There's this large China manufacturer who decided that they would invest a couple $100 million actually in Ontario to build this plant. And the brand themselves is a Canadian company, when focusing on building the Canadian brand, kind of complying with all the Canadian processes and standards. So that's great. I think it's a win-win for everybody, and they will eventually be selling to not just China, but other countries, and it's a pure kind of, that works very well too. So
profiting off the brand, literally.
Right. Yeah.
I have a question for Kevin. Can you share what industry that company is?
Well, it's the milk formula place. Yes. So it's naturally.
And maybe I could jump in there too. Actually, EDC helped support that investment into Canada.
Right, there you go.
Because we saw that as a great opportunity and as part of a broader story around integrative trade. So we're talking a lot about exports today, but investment inbound, investment outbound, as well as the two sides of trade really do come together. And in this case, creation of Canadian jobs, all that product largely, to your point, is going to be exported, and it takes advantage of a Canadian brand. So it's actually quite a cool story when you look at all different angles of that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's like a Team Canada story, by the way, because there's more people here, even in this room, involved in that project as well. So.
Right.
Great.
Okay, I've got some audience questions, and I'm going to put some of you on the hot seat. So this one, I'm going to start with Todd. How much is the fact that Canada ranks last on the OECD a factor of either business owners not trying versus a lack of program or awareness of programs to help them export?
Good question. I don't think it's a lack of trying. I think it is a little bit cultural, to be frank. In some cases, Canadian companies have been a little bit more risk averse, let's put it that way, than some of our American counterparts in terms of exploring other markets, and have been quite happy to have a successful organization and firm here in Canada, and haven't been as likely to want to do that. Part of that, I would say, as much as we just said, there's some nice Team Canada stories, there's also some areas for, I think, Team Canada to do a much better job helping to communicate what the opportunities are outside of Canada and how beneficial it can be to an organization to actually take that first step, whether it's beyond Canada or beyond the US. And I mentioned in one of my earlier comments, what we're seeing a lot of companies really trying to start to do is to use the US or to use a market in Europe as a springboard for what maybe comes next. And again, we sometimes get stuck and we think at things in a very traditional way where it's like, I make a good or I produce a service and it goes to a buyer. But actually, the ecosystem is much broader and much more dynamic than that. So if you're able to get into a supply chain of a US manufacturer who then onward sells or provides your product or service as an input to another market, you're essentially exporting your product or your service somewhere else. And to put like a fine point on it, we work with a number of companies in the medical technology area, and lots of opportunities in Europe and even parts of Africa, and it was just a bridge too far for these companies. They weren't prepared to take the risk. They didn't know the market, but they did have a relationship with Siemens in Germany, who actually then won contracts to supply hospitals in this case it was in Morocco. And so Canadian technology then, via Siemens, ended up in Morocco, and all of a sudden they're present in the market. And they're starting to be known in a continent that for them was really not something they had considered. So I think some of that is how do we tell those stories better and really raise the awareness so folks can see that that's another possible way to do it.
Part of what we're doing today. Hilton, how much a factor is our currency in winning in the US and abroad as well?
I think that a year or so ago, currency was certainly was in our, was working against us, and currency now is working for us. For us, it's not a major impact because we source most of our products from outside of Canada, and we add value in Canada before we ship it out to the US. So it hasn't been a big negative or positive, for us. So that would be my
It probably, again, depends on the product or service that you're...
I would think so, absolutely. And from a commercial perspective, because currency can be volatile, especially in an environment where trade relationships are a little bit rocky, for example, you can take some steps to secure your currency risk. You can provide currency hedge in your contractual arrangements. You can tie the currency to a particular event. There are all sorts of things that you can do strategically to help reduce that currency fluctuation risk, especially in an environment where the Canadian dollar, of course, dependent on the US value, if that is in fluctuation, or if you're looking into another market whose currency maybe is not as predictable as the currencies in which you're more accustomed to do business, there are different types of insurance products that you can take to minimize that risk.
All right, I think we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to share with the audience either a lesson learned or a piece of advice for those who are wanting to expand. I know you got some lessons learned.
Yes, well, I can speak for hours about that, but just one. I would say just not try to, when you have a hot market and you starting to get these momentum from surrounding places and they all come to you, you don't try to do it all. It's really about making an example of one successful market and dive a little deeper in that first before trying to you have 100% resources and try to do 15%. It's actually way more effective that you focus in one and then let that become your prime example to lend and then which will benefit subsequent markets. It's exciting at the beginning when you see your product is liked by a lot of countries, but at the same time, sometimes it'll take you back a couple of years when you try to do too much in a little bit of everything. So we're still trying to go through that path right now. Yeah.
Great.
I would say on my end, it would be to encourage enterprises that are expanding internationally or who are already present internationally to take every advantage of an opportunity to review supply chain arrangements. In more turbulent times, there is a higher supply chain risk. And I can give a very personal example, not from one of my clients, obviously, but my spouse is a Canadian manufacturer, a Canadian business owner who relies on he's actually a good Canadian guy, hockey rink manufacturer. So talk about the Canadian brand, he exports hockey rinks. For real. But he relies very, very heavily on Chinese product coming in, particularly the glass. And right now, his company is in a huge rut because it is very difficult to get the shipments coming in from China due to the coronavirus issue. Similarly, he has been able to source glass from 3 other vendors in Canada and in the US. But in Canada, the glass is shipped by rail, and that is not possible right now. And so we actually had a conversation last night about what he ought to be doing in the future to protect himself from these kinds of supply chain risks that happen at any given moment and sometimes are not remotely predictable. So as a lesson learned, as you expand into new markets, it's always a good policy to kind of consider diversifying where you're going to source your product and where you're going to export your product to when you don't need in the pressure crunch to find that opportunity.
Great. Hilton?
Lessons learned for me is on top of the lessons I've learned today about the opportunities outside the US and Canadian markets. I'd like to share our experience in China. We have gone in and sold NBA licensed merchandise and NHL licensed merchandise in China. So we've actually used the Canadian story, associated with hockey, with NHL, and associated with North American basketball, sport. And I think it can be effective, and we just need to do more of it and focus more to be successful.
Todd, you get the last word. What's a quick tip for our audience?
Quick tip, I guess. I used to say, go, don't Google, right? I mean, I think we, in this kind of environment, we think we can get everything we need off the internet in terms of, jurisdictional issues, customs, tax, you name it. At the end of the day, you actually need to have boots on the ground to really be successful. You need to be in the market. You need to do it through a trade show. You need to meet your buyer. You need to meet, the folks who will help you in market, and have a bit of a longer term view than I think is sometimes the case when you're just dealing with a domestic sale, because there are additional wrinkles there. And so to have that longer term view and a business plan that kind of looks out beyond the year, 3 years in terms of what does the supply chain look like? How does this all come together for us as a company, I think is essential. And then I would just tie it back to something we've been saying is absolutely take advantage of everything that's available before you even leave. So in terms of that knowledge base, in terms of the experience of counterparts, of peers in your industry, of associations, of government, of law firms and others, I think it's absolutely essential.
Great. All right.
Thank you very much. All right, just stay seated for a second there. There is nothing more Canadian than being a hockey rink manufacturer. I can't even
We didn't even know that. We didn't know that.
Maybe it would be more
That is a
Canadian if
true
we had like
story.
a training company that sold how to be nice and apologize to people. That would be the only other thing.
That would not be my husband.
Is he not nice? Is he not a nice Canadian?
He's lovely, but he's quite business driven.
Right.
Yes.
Right. We embrace diversity in
Yes.
Canada. We include everyone. A thank you to Kevin, Martha, Hilton, and Todd. Thank you so much for your insight, for your experience, and for your passion for Canadian companies. We really, really appreciate it. And Anita, thank you for leading our conversation, setting the scene so beautifully with the PwC research. It was a really, really valuable event. And so another round of applause for our panel. I love that you said go, don't Google, because it is absolutely consistent with our values as the Canadian Club. There are so many conversations that can live in a virtual world, but we have drawn a line in the sand to say that no, in person matters, and I love that's consistent with your advice in the world of exports. Before we conclude, I want to thank our 2 sponsors for today, McCarthy Tetrault and PwC. Another round of applause for making this event happen. And to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. Thank you very much to all of you for making time out of your day to join us, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.